Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're stepping into something darker than usual. The brutal world of Viking Age slavery. A reality so harsh that many who lived through it came to understand why death might be considered a mercy. This isn't the romanticized world of brave warriors and epic adventures that we often see in movies and shows. This is the other side of Viking society, where human beings became property and where the very concept of dignity was systematically destroyed, one small cruelty at a time. We're going to explore why being a thrall, that's what Vikings called their slaves, was often considered a fate worse than death itself, and how an entire society built systems designed to strip away everything that made a person human. Before we begin this journey together, take a moment to like the video if you find value in these deeper explorations of history, and subscribe if you enjoy these longer, more thoughtful dives into the past. But only if it genuinely resonates with you. I'd rather have a smaller community of people who truly connect with this content. And please, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always amazing to discover who's joining us from around the world. Whether you're winding down for the night or starting your day with a bit of history. So settle in, and let's begin this quiet exploration together. Starting with that terrible moment when everything changed, when free people became property, and when their long journey into a living hell first began. Picture a quiet morning somewhere along the coast of old Europe. Maybe it's a little monastery tucked away in green hills where monks tend their gardens and copy books by candlelight. Or perhaps it's a peaceful farming village where kids play in the wheat fields while their parents get ready for another simple day of work. The sun comes up slowly over the straw roofs, and smoke drifts gently from cooking fires. Birds sing in the nearby woods, and there's something timeless about life here, where families have lived and died in the same patterns for generations, following the same seasons, praying in the same little churches. But this peaceful scene, my friend, is more fragile than anyone living there could possibly imagine. Somewhere out beyond what they can see, long ships with dragon heads carved on their fronts are cutting through gray water. The men on these ships aren't traders or travelers. They're raiders, and they're looking for something very specific. They study the coastline with eyes that know exactly what to look for. Places that are rich but not well defended. Communities that have been safe for so long, they've forgotten how to be afraid. These Viking raids weren't random attacks by wild men, as you might picture them. No, they were carefully planned business trips. The raiders spent weeks, sometimes months, gathering information about their targets. They knew which monasteries had the most treasure, which villages had the fewest fighting men, which settlements were far enough from help that no one would come running when the screaming started. They understood the tides. They knew when people would be distracted by harvest or holy days. And most important for our story tonight, they knew which places would give them the thing they valued most: people. When those ships finally appeared on the horizon, slicing through the morning mist like something from a nightmare, everything could change in just minutes. But even this terror had a strange kind of order to it. The raiders weren't interested in just killing everyone they found. Dead people couldn't work, couldn't be sold, couldn't make anyone rich. What they wanted were living, breathing human beings who could serve them for years to come. The moment of capture often started not with fighting, but with sorting. Viking raiders moved through a settlement like farmers going through their livestock, deciding what was worth keeping and what wasn't. The very old and the very young, the sick and the badly hurt. These people were usually killed quickly. not out of cruelty exactly, but because they had no value in the slave markets that lay ahead. It was just business, cold and simple. But for those who looked useful, who seemed strong or young or healthy, a different kind of horror was about to begin. Strong young men who could do heavy work, women who could bear children, kids old enough to be useful but young enough to learn new ways. These became the focus of a process that turned human beings into things to be bought and sold. The raiders walked among their captives like shoppers at a market, checking teeth, feeling muscles, trying to guess how many years of good work they might get out of each person. Try to imagine, if you can, what it felt like to stand in that line, watching strangers decide whether you were worth keeping alive. In just a few heartbeats, everything that made you who you were simply disappeared. Your name didn't matter anymore. Your family, your friends, your place in the world, your dreams for the future, none of it existed anymore. You weren't a person making choices about your own life. You were property, something to be owned and used by someone else. The chains that came next were both real and something deeper. Iron shackles marked you as valuable enough to be worth the metal. More often, rope did the job just fine for the long trip ahead. But these physical chains were just the beginning. The real chains were forming in the minds of the captives as they began to understand what their life was going to be like from now on. They weren't individuals anymore. They were goods to be moved from one place to another and eventually sold. The walk to the ships could take days, and every step served a purpose beyond just getting there. Each mile took the captives further from any hope of rescue, further from any chance of going home. The raiders knew exactly what they were doing. By the time people reached the ships, many of them had already started to give up, to accept that their old life was gone forever. During these long walks, the captives watched their old selves disappear piece by piece. Everything they owned was taken away, not just because it was valuable, but because it connected them to who they used to be. Wedding rings, religious crosses, family treasures, even the clothes that showed where they came from or who they had been. All of it was stripped away. They were given rough, simple clothing that marked them clearly as slaves. Their hair might be cut in ways that showed their new status. Sometimes their skin was marked with dyes or brands so everyone would know at a glance what they were. The ships themselves marked another step down into their new reality. Viking boats were amazing for their time, but they were built for war and raiding, not comfort. For the Viking warriors, the cramped space and cold spray were just temporary problems they put up with for the chance of getting rich. For the captives, these same conditions were a preview of how they'd be treated for the rest of their lives, like cargo, not like people. The trip across the cold northern seas felt endless for those packed into whatever space could be found for them. Usually below deck where cargo and animals had been kept. Seasickness, which is miserable for anyone, became a special kind of torture for people who had no say in whether they wanted to make this trip or not. The constant rocking of the boat, the salt water splashing over them, the thin clothes that never kept them warm enough, all of this was just the beginning. But perhaps the worst part of the voyage was the time it gave people to think. Huddled together in the dark, wet belly of the ship, former farmers and craftsmen and mothers and children had long hours to understand what had happened to them. They listened to the Vikings above them talking and laughing, heard them planning what they'd do with their human cargo once they reached home. The captives began to learn new words, words that described them not as people, but as things. They heard themselves discussed like cattle or grain, with talk of prices and markets and the best ways to get the most work out of them. During storms, when the ship pitched and rolled violently, the captives were thrown against each other and the wooden walls of their prison. Vikings above deck might pray to their gods for safe passage, but the people below had no gods who seemed to be listening anymore. Their prayers, when they could manage them, were not for salvation, but simply for the strength to survive another day, another hour, another moment of this new existence that felt worse than any death they could have imagined. Some captives tried to hold on to who they had been by whispering their real names to each other in the darkness. Sharing memories of home, trying to keep alive the connections that had once defined them. But even these small acts of resistance felt hollow as the journey stretched on. With each day that passed, the old world grew dimmer in their minds, while the reality of their situation became harder and clearer. The raiders sometimes allowed their captives on deck for brief periods, partly to keep them healthy enough to sell, partly to break their spirits further. Standing on the deck of a Viking ship in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by gray water stretching to every horizon, the captives faced the terrible truth of their isolation. They were days or weeks from any land, and even if they somehow escaped their bonds and jumped overboard, there was nowhere to go but down into the cold depths. This vastness, this complete separation from anything familiar, was perhaps the moment when many truly understood that their old life was not just interrupted, it was over. The Vikings themselves, during these voyages, often spoke casually about their human cargo in ways that revealed how completely they had removed moral consideration from their economic activity. They might discuss which captives would bring the best prices at different markets, which ones were strong enough for the hardest labor, which might be suitable for specific types of work. They planned these people's futures like merchants planning trade routes, with careful attention to profit margins and market demands. As the ships drew closer to Viking lands, the captives began to see a landscape that would become their new prison. Rocky coasts, dark forests, settlements built of wood and stone that looked nothing like the places they had come from. Everything about this new land seemed to reinforce their status as outsiders, as people who didn't belong and never would. The very air smelled different, the birds made unfamiliar sounds, and the language spoken around them was harsh and foreign to their ears. The final approach to Viking ports was often when the full reality of the slave trade became visible to the captives. Other ships might be arriving with their own human cargo, and the docks would be busy with the business of buying and selling people. The captives could see other slaves, people who had been through this same journey months or years before, now wearing the marks of long servitude. These older slaves moved with a particular kind of careful exhaustion, their eyes down, their movements efficient but without hope. They were living previews of what awaited the new arrivals. When the ships finally reached their destination and the captives were unloaded, many could barely walk after the long voyage. But weakness was not tolerated in this new world. Those who couldn't stand were dragged or carried, because they still represented an investment that needed to be protected until it could be converted into profit. The transition from ship to shore was not a relief, but simply a change of prison, from the floating hell of the voyage to the permanent hell of slavery that awaited them on land. The very process of being unloaded drove home the complete transformation that had taken place during the journey. People who had once been free citizens of their communities, who had made decisions about their own lives and the lives of their families, were now handled like any other cargo. They were counted, sorted, and prepared for sale with the same attention and care that might be given to valuable furs or precious metals. As they were led away from the ships toward whatever holding areas or markets awaited them, many captives took what they didn't know would be their last look at the sea that had brought them to this place. Behind them lay everything they had ever known and loved, now separated by an impossible distance of dark water. Ahead lay a future that would be defined entirely by the will and whims of others, a life where their own desires and dreams would count for nothing at all. The journey into bondage was now complete, but the true horror of their situation was only beginning to reveal itself. They had survived the capture, endured the voyage, and arrived at their destination still breathing. But as they would soon learn, survival in this new world was not a blessing. It was simply the beginning of a different kind of death, one that would stretch out over years of days that would blend together in an endless cycle of labor, hunger, and the slow erosion of everything that had once made them human beings rather than property. The first thing you learned as a thrall, and you learned it quickly, was that your day began before the sun even thought about rising. In the darkness of the early morning hours, when even the chickens were still asleep, you would feel the rough shake of a hand on your shoulder, or the sharp prod of a stick against your ribs. There were no gentle wake-up calls in this new world, no slowly opening your eyes to the comfort of familiar surroundings. Instead, you woke to the immediate understanding that your body no longer belonged to you, and it was time to put it to work for someone else. The sleeping arrangements for thralls were designed with one purpose in mind: to house human property as cheaply as possible while keeping it functional enough to work. Forget any notion of privacy or comfort. Most thralls slept together in whatever space was deemed adequate by their owners, sometimes a corner of the main hall, sometimes a small outbuilding that might have previously housed animals, sometimes literally in the same spaces where livestock were kept. The message was clear and constant. You were not much different from the cattle or pigs in terms of your value and treatment. These sleeping spaces were usually nothing more than straw scattered on dirt floors, with perhaps rough woolen blankets that were shared among several people. In winter, the cold seeped through every crack and gap, and thralls would huddle together for warmth like animals. In summer, the same spaces became stifling and airless, filled with the smell of too many unwashed bodies pressed together. There were no windows in most thrall quarters. Windows were for people whose comfort mattered, whose well-being was considered important. The household hierarchy that thralls found themselves at the bottom of was as rigid and unforgiving as iron. At the top, of course, were the free family members, the husband who owned the farm or household, his wife, their children. Below them came the free servants and workers, people who might be poor but who still had rights, who could leave if they chose to, who were paid for their labor even if the payment was modest. And then, at the very bottom, were the thralls. Between the lowest free person and the highest thrall was a gap that could never be crossed, a difference that was considered as natural and permanent as the difference between human and animal. Your new master might be a successful farmer with extensive lands, or a craftsman with a workshop, or a merchant with trading connections. It didn't matter much to you what made them prosperous. What mattered was that their prosperity depended partly on your labor, and they intended to get every bit of work out of you that your body could provide. The relationship was brutally simple. They owned you completely, and you owed them everything. The work began before dawn and continued until after dark, with the specific tasks depending on the season, the household's needs, and your own particular skills or lack thereof. If you had been a farmer in your old life, you might find yourself working the same kind of land, planting and harvesting the same crops. But now every seed you planted, every stalk you cut, belonged entirely to someone else. If you had been a craftsman, you might still practice your trade, but the tools belonged to your master, the materials belonged to your master, and every item you created became your master's property to sell or use as they pleased. For women who had been captured, the work often centered around the household: cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, tending to children who were not their own. But this domestic work came with particular cruelties. A thrall woman might be forced to care tenderly for the children of the people who had destroyed her own family, to prepare meals she would not be allowed to fully share, to maintain the comfort of a household, while living in conditions that provided her no comfort at all. The irony was especially bitter for those who had once been mothers themselves. They might spend their days caring for free children, washing their clothes, preparing their food, singing them to sleep, while their own children, if they had survived the raid that brought her here, were somewhere else entirely, perhaps thralls themselves in other households, or perhaps dead. The maternal instincts that had once been directed toward their own families were now commanded by others, turned into another form of labor that could be bought and sold. The food provided to thralls was calculated with the same cold efficiency that marked everything else about their treatment. You received exactly enough to keep you working, and not a bite more. The meals were simple and repetitive: porridge made from whatever grain was cheapest, thin soup with scraps of meat or vegetables, bread that was often stale or made from inferior flour, fresh meat, good cheese, ale, honey. These were for free people. Thralls ate what was left over, what was beginning to spoil, what could be prepared with minimal cost and effort. Hunger became a constant companion, not the sharp hunger of missing a single meal, but the deeper, wearier hunger of never quite having enough. Your body learned to function on less, to make do with inadequate nutrition, but it never stopped wanting more. This persistent hunger served another purpose beyond simple cost saving. It kept thralls focused on basic survival rather than on planning escapes or resistance. When you're always slightly hungry, always tired from inadequate food, it's harder to think beyond the immediate need to get through another day. Mealtimes themselves reinforced the social order in ways both subtle and obvious. Free members of the household ate first, and they ate the best food. Servants and workers ate next, receiving simpler fare, but still sitting at proper tables, still treated as people deserving of basic dignity. Thralls ate last, often standing, often outside, receiving their portions like animals being fed, rather than human beings sharing a meal. The clothing provided to thralls followed the same pattern of calculated adequacy. You received what you needed to work and to survive the weather, but nothing more. The cloth was rough and cheap, the colors dull and practical. Any clothing you had worn in your previous life, anything that marked you as a person with taste or status or regional identity, was long gone. Instead, you wore what clearly marked you as property: simple tunics and rough trousers or dresses that were obviously the garments of slaves. In winter, this inadequate clothing became another form of suffering. While free people wore wool and fur, thralls made do with thinner materials that let the cold seep through to their bones. Frostbite was common, chilblains on hands and feet that made work even more painful, but complaining about the cold was pointless. Thralls who couldn't work because of weather-related ailments received less food, not more clothing. The daily rhythm of work was designed to fill every waking moment with productivity. There was no such thing as leisure time for a thrall, no moments when you could simply rest and think your own thoughts. If the main work of the day was finished, there were always additional tasks waiting. Firewood to gather, tools to clean and repair, animals to tend, countless small jobs that kept you busy until exhaustion finally allowed sleep. This constant activity served multiple purposes for the slave owners. Obviously, it maximized the economic value they extracted from their human property. But it also prevented thralls from forming close relationships with each other, from planning together, from developing any sense of community that might lead to organized resistance. When every moment is filled with required labor, there's little time for the conversations and connections that might nurture hope or rebellion. The tools you worked with were another reminder of your status. While free workers might own their own hammers, plows, or looms, might take pride in well-made implements that help them do good work, thralls used whatever tools were provided and were expected to be grateful for them. These tools were often the oldest and most worn-out ones, implements that free workers had discarded, but which were still considered good enough for slave labor. Personal possessions, beyond the most basic necessities, simply didn't exist for thralls. Everything you used belonged to someone else and could be taken away at any moment. This lack of personal property was another way of reinforcing that you yourself were property. Free people accumulated things. They owned their clothes, their tools, their small treasures and keepsakes. Thralls owned nothing, not even themselves. The psychological impact of this absolute lack of ownership was profound and deliberate. When you can't own anything, when every object you touch belongs to someone else, it becomes harder to maintain a sense of yourself as an individual person with your own identity and desires. You begin to see yourself through the eyes of your owners, as a tool, a resource, something useful but not particularly important beyond its utility. Interaction with free people was strictly controlled and loaded with ritual reminders of status. When thralls spoke to their owners or other free people, they were expected to keep their eyes down, to speak only when spoken to use specific words and phrases that acknowledged their inferior position. A thrall never simply said yes to a free person. It was yes, master, or yes, mistress, constant verbal reminders of who owned whom. These speech patterns, repeated hundreds of times each day, gradually reshaped how thralls thought about themselves. Language is powerful. When you're forced to refer to someone as your master dozens of times every day, when you're required to use words that diminish your own importance while elevating theirs, these words begin to echo in your mind even when you're not speaking. The external verbal hierarchy becomes an internal reality. Physical punishment was always present as a background threat, even when it wasn't being actively used. Thralls learned quickly to read the moods and expectations of their owners, to anticipate what might trigger anger or disappointment. A thrall who could avoid beatings wasn't necessarily one who worked harder, but one who had learned to be invisible when visibility might be dangerous, to appear busy when there was nothing urgent to do, to sense when their owner was having a bad day and needed someone to blame. The most skilled thralls, in a sense, were those who had learned to manage their owner's emotions as carefully as they managed their assigned tasks. They developed an almost supernatural ability to predict what would please or displease, to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to fade into the background when their presence might be unwelcome. This emotional labor, This constant attention to the psychological state of their owners was perhaps even more exhausting than the physical work they were required to do. Illness or injury presented particular challenges for thralls, because their value to their owners was entirely based on their ability to work. A sick thrall was not just suffering from whatever ailment had struck them. They were also facing the possibility that their owner might decide they were no longer worth the cost of food and shelter. Some owners provided basic care for valuable thralls, not out of compassion, but out of the same economic calculation that might lead a farmer to treat a sick horse. Others simply waited to see if the thrall would recover on their own, and if not, well, they could always acquire a replacement. The medical care available to thralls was usually limited to whatever home remedies and folk knowledge existed within the household. Professional healers, when they existed at all, were expensive and were generally reserved for free people whose health was considered important. A thrall with a broken bone might have it set by someone with basic knowledge, or they might simply be expected to let it heal as best it could while continuing to work around the injury. Pregnancy, for female thralls, represented a particularly complex situation. On one hand, children born to thrall mothers automatically became thralls themselves, representing future economic value to the owner. On the other hand, pregnancy and childbirth temporarily reduced a woman's ability to work, and there was always the risk that she might die in childbirth, taking her economic value with her. Some owners provided better food and lighter work for pregnant thralls, calculating that the investment might pay off in a healthy child. Others simply expected pregnant women to work until they physically couldn't, and then to return to full labor as soon as possible after giving birth. The children born into thraldom faced a particularly cruel fate. They grew up knowing no other life, seeing their mother's exhaustion and their father's resignation as the natural order of things. These children often adapted to slavery in ways that their parents, who remembered freedom, never could. But this adaptation came at the cost of ever understanding that life could be different, that human beings were capable of choices and dreams and the pursuit of their own happiness. Seasonal changes brought different kinds of hardship and different types of work, but never any real relief from the fundamental reality of bondage. Spring meant long days preparing fields and tending to animals giving birth. Summer brought harvesting and the constant work of preserving food for winter. Autumn meant gathering fuel and preparing for the cold months ahead. Winter, supposedly a time of rest for free people, often meant different kinds of labor for thralls. Indoor work like spinning and weaving, or the dangerous task of ice fishing, or simply the endless work of keeping fires burning and ice cleared from pathways. Each season also brought its own specific sufferings. Spring mud made everything harder and dirtier. Summer heat was particularly brutal for people doing heavy physical labor while inadequately fed and clothed. Autumn brought the knowledge that another year of freedom was gone forever, that time was passing and nothing was getting better. Winter brought cold that seemed to settle into the bones of people who never got quite enough food or warm enough clothing to properly fight it off. The gradual erosion of personal identity happened so slowly that many thralls didn't notice it happening until it was already far advanced. It started with small things, forgetting exactly how your mother's voice sounded, or losing track of what day of the week it was in your old life. Gradually, the memories that had once defined you began to fade, replaced by the immediate realities of survival and bondage. Names were often the first casualty of this erosion. Your birth name, the name your parents had chosen with love and hope, might be considered too difficult for your owners to pronounce, or simply inappropriate for a thrall. You might be given a new name that described your function, the equivalent of calling someone cook or strong back or boy. Over time, hearing this new name constantly while rarely or never hearing your real one, you might find that your old name began to feel foreign in your own mind. Religious and cultural practices from your former life became increasingly difficult to maintain. Free people might mock or forbid the observance of foreign customs or beliefs. Without the community support that had once reinforced these practices, without the physical objects and special places that had made them meaningful, maintaining your old spiritual life became almost impossible. Some thralls tried to keep their beliefs alive in secret, but this required energy and hope that were already stretched thin by the demands of simple survival. The loss of language was another subtle but devastating form of identity erosion. If you had been captured from a different region or people, you might find that your native language was gradually being replaced by the language of your captors. This wasn't usually a deliberate policy. It was simply practical necessity. You needed to understand orders, to communicate with other workers, to function in your new environment. But as your original language was used less and less, you lost not just words but ways of thinking, cultural concepts that only existed in that language, connections to the unique worldview of your birth culture. Perhaps most tragically, the skills and knowledge that had once been sources of pride became merely tools for your owner's benefit. A thrall who had been a talented weaver might still weave, but the satisfaction of creating something beautiful was replaced by the simple necessity of avoiding punishment for poor work. The joy of craftsmanship, the pride of mastery, the pleasure of creating something unique, all of this was stripped away, leaving only the mechanical repetition of learned motions. Yet even in this systematic dehumanization, small acts of resistance and humanity persisted. Thralls found ways to help each other when possible, sharing extra bits of food, offering comfort during illness, teaching necessary skills to newcomers. These small kindnesses were risky. Being caught helping another thrall might result in punishment for both people involved. But they continued anyway. Perhaps because maintaining some connection to basic human decency was necessary for psychological survival. Some thralls also found ways to preserve tiny pieces of their former selves. A woman might quietly sing lullabies from her homeland while working, even if no one else understood the words. A man might carve small symbols from his original culture into hidden places on tools or buildings. These acts of memory and defiance were usually small enough to escape notice, but they served as vital links to identities that slavery was designed to destroy. The daily rhythm of thrall life was designed to be utterly predictable and utterly controlled. You woke when you were told to wake, worked where you were told to work, ate what you were given to eat, slept when and where you were permitted to sleep. This routine, repeated day after day without variation or choice, gradually wore away at the mental faculties that had once been used for planning, dreaming, and making decisions about your own life. Free people took for granted the hundreds of small choices they made each day. When to wake up, what to wear, what to eat, where to go, who to talk to, how to spend their time. Thralls made none of these choices. Every aspect of their existence was determined by others, leaving their minds with little to do except focus on avoiding punishment and getting through each day. This lack of mental stimulation and personal agency was perhaps as damaging as the physical hardships they endured. As months turned into years, many thralls found that they had stopped thinking about escape or freedom. Not because they had accepted their situation or found peace with it, but because the mental energy required for hope and planning had been gradually worn away by the demands of constant survival. The future became impossible to imagine, except as more of the same. More work, more hunger, more cold, more of the slow grinding away of everything that had once made life worth living. This was perhaps the most insidious aspect of the thrall system. It didn't just enslave people's bodies, it gradually enslaved their minds as well, making them accomplices in their own degradation, simply through the exhaustion of existing in conditions designed to break down human dignity day by day, year after year, until death finally offered the only escape that didn't require the kind of hope and energy that slavery systematically destroyed. To understand just how completely thralls existed outside the boundaries of what Viking society considered human, we need to look at their laws, not the grand pronouncements of kings or the heroic codes sung by poets, but the everyday legal rules that governed how people bought a cow, settled a dispute over a fence, or decided what happened to property when someone died. Because in these mundane legal matters, thralls were treated exactly like any other valuable object that could be owned, traded, and passed down through generations. Viking law codes, when they bothered to mention thralls at all, spoke of them in the same language used for livestock or farming tools. A thrall had a price, just like a horse or a plow, and this price was determined by age, health, skills, and usefulness. A young, strong male thrall might be worth as much as several cattle. An older thrall, or one weakened by years of hard labor, might be valued no higher than a few sheep or a good knife. Women of childbearing age held their value longer, since they could produce more thralls for their owners, but even this potential was calculated in purely economic terms. The buying and selling of thralls happened in marketplaces alongside the trading of grain, furs, and metalwork. There was nothing secretive or shameful about it from the Viking perspective. It was simply business, as normal and acceptable as any other commercial transaction. Potential buyers would examine thralls the same way they might examine a horse they were thinking of purchasing, checking teeth and muscles, asking about work history, negotiating prices based on perceived flaws or advantages. These slave markets were gathering places where human beings were reduced to their most basic economic value. A thrall who had once been a skilled craftsman might be sold based entirely on their physical strength, with no regard for their knowledge or experience. A woman who had been a respected mother and wife in her former life might be evaluated solely on her ability to bear children and perform household labor. The complex, full human beings they had once been simply didn't exist in these transactions. When Viking families made wills or divided property after a death, thralls were listed right alongside the furniture, the tools, and the animals. A father might leave his eldest son the main farm buildings and half the thralls, while giving his younger son the remaining land and the other half of the human property. These divisions were made with the same careful attention to fairness and value that might be applied to splitting up a herd of cattle or a collection of silver arm rings. The legal system offered thralls no protection whatsoever against abuse, overwork, or even death at their owner's hands. If a free person killed another free person, there were laws about compensation, blood money that had to be paid to the victim's family, legal procedures that had to be followed. But if a free person killed a thrall, the only legal issue was whether they owed money to the thrall's owner for destroying valuable property. The thrall's own life, their suffering, their family relationships, none of this mattered in the eyes of the law. This legal invisibility extended to every aspect of a thrall's existence. They could not own property because they were property themselves. They could not enter into contracts because objects cannot make agreements. They could not testify in legal proceedings because their word was considered worthless. Not because they were thought to be liars necessarily, but because they were not considered to be people whose testimony had any meaning. Think about what this meant in practical terms. If a free person committed a crime and the only witness was a thrall, that crime was essentially unprosecutable because the witness legally didn't exist. If a thrall was injured by someone other than their owner, the legal issue was not assault or harm to a person, but damage to someone else's property. The thrall's pain, fear, or suffering were not factors that the law recognized or cared about. Marriage, for thralls, existed in a strange legal limbo that perfectly illustrated their status as property rather than people. Thralls could form relationships with each other and even have what might look like families, but these relationships had no legal recognition or protection. If an owner decided to sell one member of a thrall couple to someone far away, there was no law preventing this separation. Children born to thrall mothers belonged entirely to the mother's owner and could be sold away from their parents at any time. The psychological impact of this legal non-existence was perhaps even more devastating than the physical hardships of slave labor. When you grow up free, you learn from an early age that you have certain rights, that there are limits to what others can do to you, that society recognizes your existence as a person with legitimate interests and concerns. Thralls had to unlearn all of this and accept that they existed in a world where they had no rights at all, where anything could be done to them without legal consequence. This process of accepting legal invisibility often took years and was never complete for thralls who had once been free. They might find themselves instinctively appealing to concepts of fairness or justice, expecting that reasonable people would recognize when they were being treated wrongly, only to discover again and again that their concepts of right and wrong simply didn't apply to their situation. Free people might treat them kindly or harshly, but this treatment was based on personal whim or economic calculation, never on any recognition that thralls had rights that deserved respect. The economic value of thralls influenced how they were treated, but not in ways that provided them with genuine protection. An expensive thrall might receive better food and shelter than a cheap one, but this was like the difference between how you might treat a prize horse versus an old plow horse. It was about protecting an investment, not about recognizing the thrall as a being deserving of care for its own sake. When thralls became too old or sick to work effectively, their legal status as property created particular cruelties. Unlike free servants who might expect some care in their old age in return for years of faithful service, thralls who could no longer earn their keep became nothing but expenses. Some owners might keep old thralls around out of sentiment or habit, the way someone might keep an old dog even after it stopped being useful. Others would simply abandon them, or more mercifully perhaps, end their lives quickly, rather than continue feeding someone who could no longer work. The inheritance of thralls revealed another dimension of their dehumanization. When thralls were passed down from parent to child, families were often split up without any consideration for the emotional bonds between them. A father might inherit some thralls while his brother inherited others, with no thought given to keeping thrall families together. Children born into slavery might find themselves given away as gifts when their owners' children came of age. Separated forever from their parents and siblings, Viking society had elaborate rules about the treatment of guests, the obligations of hospitality, the respect due to strangers and travelers. These social codes were considered fundamental to civilized behavior, and violating them could result in serious social consequences. But none of these protections extended to thralls. A free stranger showing up at a farmstead expect food, shelter, and courteous treatment as a matter of basic social obligation. Thralls living in that same farmstead for years might receive no courtesy at all, because courtesy was something exchanged between people, and thralls were not legally or socially recognized as people. The religious implications of this legal status were particularly complex and troubling. Viking religion, like most belief systems, had ideas about the proper treatment of fellow human beings, concepts of honor and proper behavior that were supposed to guide how people treated each other. But these moral guidelines applied only to the treatment of other free people. The systematic dehumanization of thralls was not seen as violating religious principles because thralls were not considered part of the moral community that deserved such consideration. When thralls died, their deaths were often not even recorded in the ways that free people's deaths were remembered. Free Vikings might have elaborate funeral ceremonies, burial goods that reflected their status and achievements, memorial stones that preserved their names and deeds for future generations. Thralls were typically buried in unmarked graves with no ceremony and no goods, their deaths noted only in the sense that their owners had lost a piece of property. This erasure of death was perhaps the final insult in a system designed to deny the humanity of enslaved people. Everyone who has ever lived deserves to have their death matter to someone, to be mourned and remembered as a unique individual whose life had meaning. For thralls, even this basic human dignity was denied. They lived as property and died as property, with their passing noted no more than the breaking of a tool or the death of an animal. The legal system's treatment of thrall children was especially revealing of how completely the society had accepted the dehumanization of enslaved people. Children born to free parents were automatically free and had legal protections from the moment of birth. Children born to thrall mothers were automatically thralls, with no rights or protections at all. This wasn't seen as condemning innocent children to lives of misery. It was simply the natural extension of property law. Just as a calf born to a cow belonged to whoever owned the cow, children of thralls belonged to whoever owned their mothers. These thrall children grew up never knowing what it felt like to have legal protection or social recognition. They learned from their earliest years that their desires, fears, and dreams didn't matter to the wider world, that they existed solely to serve the interests of others. This created a particularly tragic form of psychological damage. Not the trauma of losing freedom, which adult captives experienced, but the deeper wound of never having known what freedom felt like in the first place. The buying and selling of these children was conducted with the same casual efficiency as any other commercial transaction. A child might be sold away from their parents at any age, with no consideration for the emotional bonds between them. The legal system saw no difference between separating a thrall child from their mother and separating a young animal from its mother. Both might be economically necessary, and neither involved any legally recognized harm to thinking, feeling beings. Viking law made careful distinctions between different categories of free people. Nobles, farmers, craftsmen, servants, each with their own rights and obligations. But for thralls, there were no such distinctions. Whether you had once been a king or a peasant, a priest or a warrior, a merchant or a farmer, Slavery reduced you to the same legal status: property. Your former skills, knowledge, and social position meant nothing in terms of how the law treated you. This legal flattening of all thralls into identical property was part of what made the system so psychologically destructive. People who had once held respected positions in their communities, who had been leaders or experts or authorities in some area of life, found themselves reduced to the legal equivalent of farm animals. The knowledge that they possessed skills and wisdom that were being wasted, that they had once been valuable contributors to society, who were now treated as mere objects, added another layer of suffering to their bondage. The economic calculations that determined a thrall's value were made with the same cold precision that might be applied to evaluating any other investment. Owners considered factors like remaining working years, health problems that might affect productivity, skills that might make a thrall more valuable in certain markets, and breeding potential for female thralls. These calculations were openly discussed and debated, with thralls sometimes present to hear themselves analyzed like livestock or equipment. For thralls who retained memories of their former lives, hearing themselves discussed in these terms was a special form of torture. They were forced to listen to free people debate their monetary worth while completely ignoring their worth as human beings. Their fears, hopes, relationships, and personal history were irrelevant to these discussions. Only their economic value mattered. The legal system's treatment of violence against thralls revealed the complete absence of any recognition of their basic humanity. If someone injured or killed another person's thrall, the legal remedy was simple compensation for damaged property. There were no additional penalties for causing suffering to a thinking, feeling being. No recognition that destroying a thrall meant ending a unique individual life with its own experiences and relationships. This meant that thralls lived in constant awareness that violence against them carried no real legal consequences. An angry free person might strike or even kill a thrall in a moment of rage, knowing that the worst result would be having to pay the owner for damaged property. This legal vulnerability created a climate of constant fear and uncertainty that added psychological torture to the physical hardships of slave labor. The complete absence of legal rights extended to every aspect of a thrall's existence. They could not seek legal remedy for any wrong done to them, could not protect their property, since they couldn't own property, could not even protect their own bodies from harm. They existed in a state of absolute vulnerability that free people, with their various legal protections and social connections, could barely imagine. Perhaps most cruelly, the legal system offered thralls no path to seek justice even for the most extreme abuses. A thrall who was tortured, starved, overworked to the point of permanent injury, or sexually abused had no legal recourse whatsoever. The law simply didn't recognize that any of these things could constitute crimes when done to property. The thrall's suffering was legally meaningless, their pain invisible to a system that only recognized the economic interests of property owners. This legal framework created a society where the systematic dehumanization of enslaved people was not just permitted, but actively supported by the formal structures of law and government. It wasn't enough for Viking society to enslave people. They created legal systems that denied the very humanity of enslaved people, making their suffering invisible and their lives meaningless in the eyes of law and custom. The inheritance laws that treated thralls as property to be passed down through generations ensured that the children and grandchildren of enslaved people would face the same legal invisibility as their ancestors. There was no legal mechanism for a thrall to earn freedom. No recognition that years of faithful service might deserve some consideration. No acknowledgement that thralls might have their own family relationships that deserve protection. Living within this system of complete legal dehumanization was like existing in a world where you were simultaneously visible and invisible. Visible as an object that could be useful or valuable, invisible as a being with your own interests, feelings, and moral worth. This legal invisibility infected every interaction thralls had with the wider world, reminding them constantly that they existed outside the boundaries of what their society considered fully human. The psychological weight of existing in this legal limbo was something that free people, surrounded by their various rights and protections, could never fully understand. They lived in a world where their personhood was automatically recognized and legally protected, where they had remedies for wrongs done to them, where their relationships and property were safeguarded by law and custom. Thralls lived in the same physical world, but in a completely different legal and social reality. One where they were objects rather than subjects, property rather than people. Invisible to the very systems that were supposed to provide order and justice to human society. The transformation of a free person into a thrall wasn't just about changing their legal status or work conditions. It was about fundamentally altering their very body and soul until they no longer resembled the human being they had once been. This process began almost immediately after capture and continued relentlessly until death. A systematic destruction of both physical dignity and spiritual identity that was designed to make escape from slavery not just practically difficult, but psychologically impossible. The first marks of bondage were often the most visible ones. Many thralls received distinctive haircuts that immediately identified their status to anyone who saw them. These weren't simply practical cuts to keep hair out of the way during work. They were deliberate markings that branded a person as property. A thrall's hair might be shaved in patterns that no free person would ever wear, or cut so short and roughly that it looked nothing like the carefully maintained styles that marked social status among the free population. For people who had once taken pride in their appearance, who had worn their hair in styles that connected them to their families, their regions, or their social positions, these forced haircuts were a form of spiritual violence. Hair, in most cultures, carries deep meaning about identity, beauty, and belonging. When that hair was cut away against a person's will, in patterns that marked them as slaves, it removed not just the physical covering, but the cultural and personal identity that had been expressed through it. The clothing forced upon thralls served a similar purpose of marking and degrading. While free people might wear garments that showed their wealth, their regional origins, their family connections, or their personal taste, thralls were dressed in simple, rough clothing that was identical to what other slaves wore. This wasn't just about saving money on better cloth, it was about erasing individual identity and replacing it with the uniform appearance of property. The colors, when there were any colors at all, were deliberately dull and ugly. Free people might wear bright reds, deep blues, rich yellows that had been dyed with expensive materials and careful techniques. Thrall clothing was usually the color of undyed wool or linen, or dyed with the cheapest, most basic materials that produced muddy browns and dingy grays. These colors didn't just mark someone as poor, they marked them as beneath the concern of anyone who might care about beauty or dignity. The physical modifications to thralls' bodies went far beyond clothing and haircuts. Many owners marked their human property with permanent signs of ownership, just as they might brand cattle or mark tools with their identifying symbols. These marks could be scars cut into the skin, tattoos applied with crude methods, or brands burned into flesh with hot metal. The pain of receiving these marks was just the beginning. They served as permanent reminders to thralls and everyone who saw them that this person was owned by someone else. These marking practices varied from place to place and owner to owner, but they all served the same fundamental purpose: to make it impossible for a thrall to hide their status or pretend to be free. A thrall with distinctive scars or tattoos could never successfully run away and blend into another community. Their body itself became a prison, carrying the evidence of their bondage wherever they went. The locations chosen for these marks were often deliberately visible: faces, hands, necks, places that couldn't be hidden by clothing. This ensured that thralls would be immediately recognized as slaves in any social situation. But sometimes the marks were placed in more private locations, serving not to identify thralls to others, but to remind the thralls themselves, every time they washed or dressed, that their body was not their own. The process of applying these marks was often made deliberately traumatic, not because the trauma was necessary for creating the mark itself, but because the fear and pain served to break down the thrall's sense of personal autonomy. Being held down while strangers cut or burned your flesh was an experience of complete helplessness that reinforced the message that your body belonged to others and they could do whatever they wanted with it. For women thralls, the physical modifications often included deliberate damage to their appearance in ways that would make them less attractive to free men, but didn't reduce their value as workers or breeders. Their hair might be cut in particularly unflattering ways, their clothing might be designed to hide any physical beauty they possessed, or they might receive facial scars that marked them permanently as slaves. This wasn't about preventing sexual exploitation. Masters often used female thralls for their own pleasure, but about ensuring that thralls could never attract the romantic interest of free people who might help them escape or improve their condition. The daily physical treatment of thralls was designed to wear down their bodies in ways that went beyond the natural effects of hard work. Free laborers, even poor ones, usually had some control over their working conditions. They could rest when they needed to, seek help when they were injured, or refuse work that was unreasonably dangerous. Thralls had no such control. They worked when ordered to work, regardless of injury, illness, or exhaustion, and they worked at whatever tasks their owners assigned, regardless of the danger or difficulty. This relentless physical exploitation left its marks on thralls' bodies in ways that became permanent indicators of their status. Their hands became permanently roughened and scarred from work that free people would do with proper tools and protection. Their backs bent from years of carrying heavy loads without adequate rest. Their feet became deformed from walking and standing on hard surfaces without proper footwear. Over time, these physical changes made it obvious to anyone who looked that this person had spent years doing the hardest kinds of manual labor. The medical care available to thralls was calculated with the same cold efficiency that governed every other aspect of their treatment. Injuries and illnesses that didn't interfere with work were generally ignored, while problems that threatened a thrall's economic value might receive basic treatment. But this treatment was never about the thrall's comfort or long-term health. It was about protecting an investment, the same way a farmer might treat a sick cow or a lame horse. Pain relief, when it was provided at all, was minimal and grudging. Thralls were expected to work through levels of pain that would have sent free people to their beds, and complaining about pain was often seen as laziness or insubordination, rather than a legitimate medical concern. The message was clear: your physical suffering doesn't matter unless it interferes with your ability to work, and even then, it matters only as an economic problem, not as human suffering that deserves attention and care. The spiritual degradation of thralls was even more systematic and complete than their physical marking. Religion and spiritual practices are fundamental to most people's sense of identity and belonging, their understanding of their place in the universe, and their connection to something larger than themselves. Viking society deliberately excluded thralls from these spiritual communities, leaving them not just physically marked as property, but spiritually isolated from the sources of meaning and comfort that sustained free people. Thralls were typically forbidden from participating in the religious ceremonies that marked the rhythm of Viking life. They couldn't attend the seasonal festivals that celebrated the agricultural cycle, the ceremonies that honored the gods, or the ritual gatherings that reinforced community bonds. These exclusions weren't just about preventing thralls from gathering in groups where they might plan resistance. They were about denying them access to the spiritual resources that might help them maintain their sense of dignity and hope. The gods that Vikings worshipped were seen as the gods of free people, deities who were interested in the honor, courage, and achievements of warriors and free farmers and craftsmen. These gods were not understood to care about the sufferings of slaves or to offer them any protection or hope for better treatment. Thralls were left to face their hardships without the spiritual support that their owners took for granted, abandoned not just by human society but by the divine powers that supposedly governed the world. When thralls died, their exclusion from spiritual community continued even beyond death. Free Vikings expected to go to halls of the gods, where they would feast and fight alongside other honored dead. Thralls had no such expectations. Their deaths were not seen as transitions to honored afterlives, but simply as the end of useful property. They were buried without ceremony, often in unmarked graves, with no prayers said for their souls, and no expectations that they would be remembered or honored in any afterworld. This spiritual abandonment was perhaps the cruelest aspect of thraldom, because it attacked the deepest human need for meaning and connection to something beyond immediate physical existence. Even people who can endure terrible physical hardships often draw strength from their spiritual beliefs, from the sense that their suffering has meaning or that justice will eventually be done. Thralls were systematically denied access to these sources of spiritual strength. The language used to describe thralls reinforced their spiritual degradation by placing them outside the categories that defined human beings in relationship to the divine. Free people were described using words that emphasized their connection to family lineages, their relationships with gods and ancestors, their potential for honor and achievement. Thralls were described using words that emphasized their utility, their physical characteristics, their economic value, language that treated them more like animals or objects than like beings with souls. Even their names reflected this spiritual diminishment. Many thralls were given names that described their function or appearance rather than honoring ancestors or expressing hopes for their future. A thrall might be called simply Strongback or Cook or Boy, names that reduced them to their economic role rather than recognizing them as individuals with their own identity and potential. The rituals that marked important transitions in free people's lives, birth, coming of age, marriage, death, were either forbidden to thralls or conducted in deliberately degraded forms that emphasized their inferior status. A thrall woman giving birth might receive no blessing for her child, no prayers for a safe delivery, no celebration of new life. Instead, the birth was treated simply as the production of new property, noted only for its economic implications. Marriage between thralls, when it was permitted at all, received no religious blessing or community recognition. These relationships existed at the sufferance of owners who might separate the couples at any time for economic reasons. Without spiritual or legal recognition, these partnerships had no protection and little meaning beyond the personal comfort they might provide to the individuals involved. The coming-of-age ceremonies that marked free children's transition to adult status were completely denied to thrall children. Instead of celebrations that recognized their growing maturity and potential, thrall children simply moved from lighter work to heavier work, from smaller responsibilities to larger ones. There was no recognition that they were developing into individuals with their own thoughts, dreams, and capabilities. They were simply becoming more valuable property as they grew stronger and more skilled. The seasonal festivals that connected free people to the natural cycles of the year and the agricultural rhythms that sustained life were another source of spiritual meaning denied to thralls. While free people celebrated planting and harvest, the summer and winter solstices, the returning of light after the darkest days, thralls continued their work without pause or recognition that these transitions had any meaning beyond the practical changes they brought to work routines. These festivals were times when free communities came together to reinforce their shared values, to honor their gods, to strengthen the bonds between families and neighbors. Thralls were excluded from these gatherings, left to continue their labor while others celebrated, reminded once again that they existed outside the spiritual and social community that gave meaning to life in Viking society. The stories and songs that preserved cultural memory and transmitted values from one generation to the next were another form of spiritual sustenance denied to thralls. Free children grew up hearing tales of heroic ancestors, learning the myths that explained how the world worked, absorbing the cultural wisdom that would guide them through life. Thrall children heard none of these stories, or heard them only as outsiders, understanding that these tales of honor and achievement were not meant for people like them. Instead of cultural stories that might give them pride in their heritage or hope for their future, Thrall children learned only the practical knowledge they needed to perform their assigned work. They learned to fear their owner's anger, to recognize the signs that might indicate punishment or reward, to navigate the complex social hierarchy that placed them at the bottom. But they learned nothing that might help them understand themselves as part of a larger human story, or give them reason to believe that their lives had meaning beyond their economic utility. The exclusion from storytelling traditions meant that thralls gradually lost connection to their own cultural heritage. Parents who had been captured from other lands might try to preserve their original languages, customs, and beliefs for their children, but without community support, and in the face of active discouragement from their owners, these efforts usually failed within a generation or two. Thrall children grew up culturally rootless, belonging neither to their parents' lost heritage nor to the Viking culture that rejected them. The physical and spiritual degradation of thralls was designed to be self-reinforcing, each element supporting and strengthening the others. The physical marks and poor treatment made it impossible for thralls to present themselves as anything other than slaves, while the spiritual exclusion ensured that they had no internal resources to draw upon for resistance or hope. Over time, many thralls internalized these messages about their worthlessness, beginning to see themselves through the eyes of their oppressors. This internalization was perhaps the most successful aspect of the system of degradation. When people begin to believe that they truly are inferior, that they deserve their treatment, that they are incapable of anything better, they become their own jailers. They stop looking for opportunities to escape or resist, not just because such opportunities are rare, but because they no longer believe they deserve freedom or would know what to do with it if they had it. The children born into this system of physical and spiritual degradation faced particular challenges because they had no memory of ever being treated as full human beings. They grew up accepting their marked bodies, their exclusion from spiritual community, their treatment as property, as the natural order of things. Breaking free from this internalization required not just physical escape, but psychological transformation that many never achieved. Yet even within this system designed to destroy human dignity, some thralls found ways to maintain fragments of their spiritual lives and physical pride. They might pray in secret to gods their owners didn't recognize, maintain small personal rituals that connected them to their heritage, or find ways to care for their bodies and appearance within the narrow constraints allowed to them. These acts of resistance were small and hidden, but they represented the stubborn persistence of human dignity, even under conditions designed to destroy it completely. The systematic marking and degradation of thralls' bodies and souls was ultimately about more than just maintaining control over enslaved people. It was about protecting the psychological comfort of the free population. By making thralls visibly and obviously different from free people, by excluding them from spiritual community, by treating them as less than human, Viking society made it easier for free people to participate in or ignore the slavery system without feeling that they were harming fellow human beings. This elaborate system of dehumanization allowed ordinary free people to benefit from slave labor while telling themselves that they were not really exploiting people like themselves. The marks, the exclusions, the degradation, all of it served to create a psychological barrier that made it possible for free Vikings to see thralls as a different category of being entirely deserving of different treatment and unworthy of the moral consideration that free people owed to each other. The physical and spiritual degradation of thralls was thus the keystone of the entire slavery system, the mechanism that made it possible for a society to systematically exploit human beings while maintaining its own sense of moral righteousness. By destroying the bodies and souls of enslaved people, Viking society created the illusion that these people were not fully human and therefore did not deserve the rights, protections, and considerations that free people took for granted. In the dim world of thraldom, where hope had been systematically crushed and human dignity deliberately destroyed, there existed a few flickering possibilities for freedom that were so rare and difficult that they seemed almost mythical to most slaves. These paths to manumission were like distant stars in a dark sky, visible enough to know they existed, but so far away and unreachable that looking at them often brought more pain than comfort. The most common path to freedom, though still extraordinarily rare, was through the deliberate choice of an owner to release a thrall from bondage. This act, known as manumission, could happen for various reasons, but it was always entirely at the discretion of the master and could never be demanded or expected by the thrall. Some owners, in their old age or on their deathbeds, might free long-serving thralls as a kind of final gesture of generosity. Others might grant freedom as a reward for exceptional service, loyalty, or skill that had proven particularly valuable over many years. But even when manumission was granted, it rarely meant complete freedom in the way that people born free understood it. A freed thrall, called a freedman or freedwoman, occupied a strange middle position in Viking society, no longer property, but not quite equal to those who had never been enslaved. They might still owe certain obligations to their former owners, might be required to provide labor or payments for years after their official release, might find that their children inherited some of the social disadvantages that came with having slave ancestry. The psychological challenge of accepting freedom was often as difficult as the practical challenges of living as a freed person. After years or decades of having every decision made by someone else, of existing without personal autonomy or the right to make choices about their own lives, many freed thralls found the responsibility of freedom overwhelming. They had been systematically trained to be passive, to wait for orders, to suppress their own desires and opinions. Learning to think and act as free people required rebuilding psychological capacities that slavery had deliberately destroyed. Some freed thralls chose to remain with their former owners, not because they were required to, but because the world outside seemed too dangerous and uncertain. They had learned to navigate the limited safety of their position as valuable property, and the wider world of free society felt hostile and unpredictable. These freed people often continued to live much as they had before, working for their former masters, but now receiving small payments or shares of crops rather than just basic subsistence. The children of freed thralls faced their own unique challenges. While they were born free, they carried the social stigma of slave ancestry that could affect their prospects for marriage, employment, and social acceptance for generations. Freeborn Vikings often looked down on these families, considering them tainted by their connection to slavery, even though they had committed no crime other than being descended from people who had been unlucky enough to be captured in raids. For most thralls, however, manumission remained nothing more than a distant dream that sustained them through the darkest moments of their bondage. They might hear stories of someone, somewhere, who had been granted freedom, and these tales would circulate through the slave quarters like legends of magical transformations. But for every story of successful manumission, there were hundreds of thralls who would live and die in bondage without ever experiencing even a day of freedom. The economic realities of Viking society made widespread manumission unlikely. Thralls represented significant investments for their owners, and freeing them meant giving up valuable property with no expectation of compensation. Unlike some other slave societies, where slaves might be allowed to earn money and eventually purchase their own freedom, the Viking thrall system provided no such opportunities. Thralls owned nothing, earned nothing, and had no legal right to accumulate property that might be used to buy their liberty. Another path to freedom, even rarer than manumission, was escape. But the practical difficulties of successful escape were so enormous that few thralls even attempted it, and fewer still succeeded. Escaped thralls faced immediate problems of survival. They had no money, no food, no proper clothing for traveling, and no knowledge of the geography beyond their immediate area. They were also easily identifiable by their slave markings, their rough clothing, and their obvious unfamiliarity with the customs and expectations of free society. Even if an escaped thrall managed to travel some distance from their owner's territory, they faced the problem of where to go and how to survive. Every free person they encountered was a potential threat who might capture them and return them to their owner for a reward. Foreign lands might seem to offer sanctuary, but getting there required knowledge, resources, and connections that thralls simply didn't have. The few successful escapes that did occur often involved thralls who had special knowledge or skills that helped them navigate the challenges of flight. A thrall who had once been a sailor might understand navigation and weather patterns. Someone who had been captured from a neighboring region might know the language and customs well enough to blend in if they could reach their homeland. But even these advantages rarely proved sufficient to overcome the systematic disadvantages that made escape nearly impossible. Most escape attempts ended in recapture within days or weeks, followed by punishment that was designed not just to discipline the individual thrall, but to discourage others from similar attempts. These punishments could include additional marking that made future escape even more difficult, confinement in conditions that were worse than normal slave quarters, or physical mutilation that reduced the thrall's value but served as a visible warning to others. The punishment of recaptured thralls was often deliberately public, conducted where other thralls could see and understand the consequences of attempting to flee. This served as a form of psychological control that extended far beyond the individual being punished. Every thrall who witnessed these punishments absorbed the message that escape was not just difficult, but ultimately futile, that the brief taste of freedom was not worth the terrible suffering that would follow recapture. For many thralls, the impossibility of escape and the extreme rarity of manumission left death as the only realistic end to their suffering. But even death, in the world of thraldom, was not a simple release from bondage. The deaths of thralls were controlled by their owners just as thoroughly as their lives had been, and even the timing and manner of their dying was rarely their own choice. Most thralls died as they had lived, working until their bodies simply could no longer continue. They died of exhaustion, of injuries sustained during labor, of illnesses that were left untreated, because treating them would have cost more than the thrall was worth. They died in the fields where they had spent their lives, in the workshops where they had labored, in the cold quarters where they had tried to rest between days of endless work. The deaths of old or sick thralls presented economic problems for their owners. A thrall who could no longer work was a drain on resources, consuming food and shelter without producing anything of value in return. Some owners dealt with this problem by simply abandoning sick or elderly thralls, leaving them to die of exposure or starvation away from the household. Others ended their thralls' lives more directly, considering it a mercy that spared both the thrall and the owner from the prolonged suffering of a slow decline. These killings were not considered murder in Viking society because thralls were property rather than people, and an owner had the right to dispose of their property as they saw fit. The legal system that protected free people from violence offered no such protection to thralls, who could be killed by their owners without legal consequence. This absolute power over life and death was perhaps the clearest expression of how completely thralls had been removed from the category of beings whose lives had inherent value. Some thralls, faced with the hopelessness of their situation and the certainty that their suffering would continue until natural death finally claimed them, chose to end their own lives rather than continue in bondage. These suicides were acts of final resistance, the last assertion of personal autonomy available to people who had been denied all other forms of self-determination. The methods available for suicide were limited by the constant supervision and restricted environment in which thralls lived. They might refuse to eat until starvation claimed them, though this required a strength of will that was difficult to maintain over the weeks or months such a death would take. They might seek out opportunities for fatal accidents, though these had to be arranged carefully to avoid suspicion and prevent their owners from taking measures to keep them alive against their will. Some thralls chose more violent methods of self-destruction, hanging themselves with rope or cloth when they could find privacy, drowning themselves in rivers or wells, or deliberately provoking their owners to lethal violence by acts of open rebellion that they knew would result in immediate death. These suicides were often planned with careful attention to timing and circumstances, representing perhaps the most complex decisions that thralls were able to make about their own lives. The reaction of owners to thrall suicides revealed the purely economic way they viewed their human property. A thrall's death by suicide was seen primarily as the destruction of valuable property, comparable to a horse breaking its leg or a building burning down. There was rarely any consideration of what suffering might have driven a person to choose death over continued life. No reflection on whether the conditions of thraldom might have been improved to prevent such losses. Instead, owners often responded to thrall suicides by implementing additional controls designed to prevent future economic losses from self-destruction. They might increase supervision, remove potential means of suicide from slave quarters, or impose collective punishments on other thralls to discourage similar acts. The focus was always on protecting the investment, never on addressing the conditions that made death seem preferable to life. For thralls who witnessed the suicides of their fellow slaves, these deaths carried complex meanings. On one hand, they represented the ultimate tragedy. People so destroyed by their circumstances that they preferred non-existence to continued life. On the other hand, they were also expressions of human agency, final assertions that even slaves retained the power to make one last choice about their own fate. These conflicting interpretations of suicide among thralls reflected the psychological complexity of living in bondage. Many thralls simultaneously envied the courage of those who chose death, while feeling horrified by the desperation that such a choice represented. They understood both the relief that death might bring and the terrible defeat that choosing death represented. The children of thralls faced particular anguish when contemplating the meaning of suicide among their community. They had never known freedom and so could not fully understand what had been lost, but they could see the effects of bondage in the exhausted faces and broken spirits of the adults around them. For young thralls, suicide represented not escape from a former life that had been destroyed, but escape from the only life they had ever known. Some thrall children grew up with the understanding that death was the only future they could realistically hope for, that their lives would follow the same pattern of suffering they saw in their parents and other adult slaves. This knowledge created a particular kind of despair that was different from the grief of adults who remembered better times. It was the despair of people who had never experienced hope, and so had no memory of what they were missing. The seasonal patterns of thrall deaths revealed the systematic cruelty of the bondage system. More thralls died in winter when inadequate food and shelter, combined with increased demands for fuel gathering and indoor labor, to push weakened bodies beyond their limits. More died during harvest times, when the pressure to bring in crops led to extended work days and increased accidents from exhaustion and haste. These patterns were well known to slave owners, who factored them into their economic calculations, just as they might account for seasonal variations in crop yields or livestock mortality. The deaths of thralls were anticipated and planned for, with owners maintaining larger numbers of slaves than they strictly needed to account for expected losses from disease, accidents, and despair. The disposal of thrall bodies after death was conducted with the same lack of ceremony that had characterized their treatment in life. Most were buried in unmarked graves, with no religious rituals, no mourning ceremonies, no memorials to preserve their memory. Their deaths were noted, if at all, only in the sense that their owners had lost property that would need to be replaced. The mass graves that archaeologists have found at some Viking sites tell the story of this casual disposal of human remains. Bodies of thralls were often buried together without individual consideration, sometimes in the same areas where animal carcasses were disposed of, reinforcing even in death their status as property rather than people. For the thralls who survived the deaths of their fellow slaves, each loss was a reminder of their own probable fate and a weakening of the fragile community bonds that provided some small comfort in their harsh existence. The death of a friend, a lover, a child, or a parent left survivors more isolated and more vulnerable to the psychological destruction that the slave system was designed to inflict. Yet even facing these inevitable endings, some thralls managed to find small reasons to continue living from day to day. They might draw comfort from relationships with other slaves, from brief moments of natural beauty, from the satisfaction of completing work well despite its involuntary nature, or from religious or spiritual beliefs that survived despite official exclusion from community worship. These tiny sources of meaning and comfort were perhaps the most remarkable aspects of life in thraldom, the persistence of human dignity and hope, even under conditions designed to destroy them completely. They represented the stubborn refusal of the human spirit to be entirely crushed, even when every external condition seemed designed to prove that such crushing was inevitable. The rare stories of thralls who lived to old age and died natural deaths, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had also known only bondage, carried their own complex meanings. These were both success stories. People who had survived the brutality of the system long enough to see multiple generations, and profound tragedies, representing families that had spent entire lifetimes in conditions that denied their basic humanity. The freed thralls, who managed to establish families and pass down stories of their bondage to free descendants, served as living links between the world of slavery and the world of freedom. Their children and grandchildren, born free but shaped by their parents' memories of bondage, often carried a particular understanding of how fragile freedom could be and how quickly human dignity could be destroyed by systematic oppression. As we reach the end of our quiet journey through the world of Viking thraldom, we're left with the sobering understanding that for most people caught in this system, death was indeed a kinder fate than continued life in bondage. The rare possibilities for freedom were so remote and difficult that they served more as sources of additional torment than genuine hope. The various forms of death that claimed thralls, from exhaustion, disease, violence, or their own desperate choice, were often the only escape from a system designed to extract every possible moment of useful labor from human beings, while denying them every aspect of dignity, autonomy, and hope that makes life worth living. Yet in the persistence of small acts of kindness between thralls, in their efforts to maintain fragments of their original identities, in their continued capacity for love and grief and occasional joy even under the most dehumanizing conditions, we see something that their oppressors could never fully destroy: the essential humanity that survived even when everything else had been stripped away.